Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually somewhat predicted in this article I read a while back. One part of the article claims that there are differences between being oppressed and being a settler. If people are unable to distinguish between the two, then they risk perpetuating the very colonial dynamics they claim to resist. Overall, I guess that this video won't just be encompassing Black Americans, but also other settler immigrants, in hopes that they can, in more detail, understand these dynamics and be able to not repeat these cycles of oppression and control. Black Americans are just the most prominent example I see happening currently. So this article describes a settler move to innocence called colonial equivocation. To elaborate on this, I quickly want to read you guys this quote. Describing all struggles against imperialism as decolonizing creates a convenient ambiguity between decolonization and social justice work, especially among people of color, queer people, and other groups minoritized by the settler nation state. We are all colonized may be a true statement, but is deceptively abrasive and vague. Its inference is that none of us are settlers. End quote. This derives from the article Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, written by Eva Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, and that quote can be found on page 17. It is a fact that we are all affected by colonization, but by saying that we are all colonized, the implication is that no one is a settler, which can ignore the fact that some people of color can still be settlers on indigenous land that was taken from us. In movements where people of marginalized groups can come together to fight shared forms of oppression, there is a real temptation to emphasize unity over difference. Now, when addressing these issues, these individuals need to move with caution, because if coalition spaces don't make space for indigenous sovereignty and don't recognize the difference between being oppressed and being a settler, then they risk reproducing the same colonial dynamics they claim to oppose. Now, this is where I see the issue around Black Americans identifying as Native American begin to arise. Look, I'm not trying to divide or cancel each other. I'm simply trying to highlight the importance of being more precise, accountable, and just in how we understand and resist systems of power. Now, first, we need to look at why people claim indigenous identity to begin with.
Hello wonderful people, welcome once again to another episode on my YouTube channel. If you are new here, feel free to subscribe. Our consultation today will be on people calling Black Americans settlers. Black Americans are not and will never be settlers in America. Settler colonialism has ruined the lives of indigenous people across the globe, but Black Americans are the product of said settler colonialism. The Dutch, English, French, Spanish are the settlers around the world that have stolen indigenous lands and changed the framework of the world. Let's watch the argument from the following videos.
Black people truly have no allies, and solidarity is really out the window in my mind for everyone under the POC umbrella. But especially when it comes to Black people, it appears that we are just the can everybody wants to kick around. A Native woman came online and said that Black people are settlers. We are the settlers under the settler colonialism.
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually somewhat predicted in this article. There are differences between being oppressed and being a settler. If people are unable to distinguish between the two, then they think Black Americans, but also other settler immigrants. It is a fact that we are all affected by colonization, but by saying that we are all colonized, the implication is that no one is a settler, which can ignore the fact that some people of color can still be settlers on indigenous land.
You may be thinking to yourself, how does that make any sense? Because a Native definitely knows that African Americans are a product of enslaved people. But she's tying it to all those pretendians who saying that they're the original inhabitants of this land. They're the original Indians. They're the natives of this land, even though that's not all of us. So to take a claim that's made by a small percentage of Black people in this country and then say that all Black people are settlers is really crazy. Settler colonialism is a logic and structure using colonial rule to overtake an environment and replace it with your own people and replace the indigenous people, which has happened here. Black people did not settle in America by choice. Anybody that has settled around the world under the imperialistic guise that happened during the Great Scramble for Africa, for China, India, Australia, and Americas, that was Europeans. We did not settle here. We were forced here by slavery, a system of slavery, one of the biggest migration of human bodies in human history. And we then spent hundreds of years here under forced labor, while at the same time, I can hold two truths. At the same time, your ancestors were killed, were taken out by biological warfare, your land was stolen, there were land grabs, you were forced into settlements, you were forced into containment areas. That is true, but we didn't do that. We didn't take your land over. If anything, the Malian kingdom definitely visited America hundreds of years before Europe. Scandinavians visited the America hundreds of years before Columbus. But the French, the Dutch, the English, they stayed. The Spanish, they stayed. This conversation is crazy. I feel like every day there's always something new that's coming up about Black Americans that people feel the need to use us to drive their point home. Two things can be true. This can be your land, you can be colonized, you can be displaced, and settlers took your land. I can be the product of colonialism by forced migration and slavery. Wow. Because the Pretendians are coming online saying that they're the natives, you're saying that we all are settlers. I've heard it all. I've heard it all.
Not just race. People of color can be both oppressed and settlers at the same time, depending on the context.
Wait a minute, what? So basically you're coming for African Americans because you all were promised equal power in your treaty that has not been acknowledged and has not been honored. And that's somehow our fault? This content creator made a video essentially saying that Black people benefit from colonialism. Ain't that some bullshit? Why the fuck people just don't leave us alone? How the fuck we benefit from something where we were brought here against our will? Not only that, we were murdered, we were raped, we were eaten, we were beaten, we were slaughtered, we were fed to alligators. And you're saying that we benefited from colonialism, and we still do, because we have jobs and have homes and have land and we work and we get benefits from the government and pay taxes. So we're the enemy now? It seems like your problem is with the wrong persons. It seems like you don't want to offend your oppressor because somehow, some way, you really still feel like there's an opportunity in y'all having equal rights and equal power over the United States. And I'm here to tell you, boo-boo, that's not going to happen. I promise you that. It seems like y'all, in the time, your ancestors should have fought a little bit harder. To keep what was rightfully yours. You want them to restore sovereignty. That doesn't have to be restored if y'all just fought a little harder. Don't you think so? Now you see how crazy that sounds when your ancestors were beaten, raped, murdered, and things were stolen from them? Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? We were taken from West Africa and our land was taken over. Have you ever heard of Mansa Musa? He was the richest, wealthiest person in the world that ever existed. Our ancestors were stripped of their wealth. They were stripped of their resources, and we were bought here through our ancestors. And then you go on to say in your video, well, I don't feel like y'all should have to leave the United States. I don't feel like you should have to leave the land. Bitch, we're not. We built this shit. For you to sit up here and say, well, I just had trouble trying to phrase it the right way. Maybe you should redo some research. Maybe you should keep your mouth shut before you get on this platform and say the most ignorant shit that you could ever think of. It is not our fault that y'all were not given equal power as stated in your treaty and you want your sovereignty to be restored. Mind you, you all got reparations. You all get Native American TANF and Native American stamps, and you have had decades upon decades of settlements, decades upon decades of reparations. Your family is set for life. Your kids are set for life. We weren't given anything. And whenever we say anything about it, it's, oh, you're throwing the black card, you're throwing the race card. And for you to say the oppressed are settlers, girl, get the fuck out my face. Respectfully, please.
Black Americans' claim of being the original indigenous people of this land was actually...
I agree with you that it's inherently wrong for Black Americans to mischaracterize our ethnogenesis in this country as indigeneity. I think it's inappropriate and disrespectful when Black people who are not Afro-Indigenous claim that they're Native American. And I know that Black Americans today do benefit from settler colonialism, thus making us complicit in the continued oppression of indigenous people. I agree with your analysis on how people who experience oppression can also be oppressors. Where I feel like the argument kind of breaks down and you're getting pushback is that you don't really seem to have an understanding of the ethnogenesis of Black Americans. And also, describing us as settlers means that we had some kind of agency or choice or power in being here or being brought here, and we did it. I don't know that you could describe enslaved Africans who were brought here or their descendants as settler immigrants. We didn't choose to be here, and we ain't got nowhere to go to. You also brought up why someone would want to be considered native, and you brought up, access to tribal resources, credibility, clout, if you will, or, it could even be a mistake that's rooted in misinformed family lore. I'm not dismissing that this stuff happens. I think that the relationship between Black Americans and indigenous people is more complex than you're presenting. Let's start off talking about, allocation of resources. I'm sure you already know, but for the sake of people who don't know, tribal entities have government-to-government relationships with the United States, and a lot of that is rooted in Indian law. Tribes do have other economic investments that bring money into their community as well, and recognized members of this community are entitled to some of those funds, which is why it's important to be able to identify who's native and who's not. And I understand that this is where that's coming, because you can be a member of a tribe without being recognized as Indian by the U.S. government, or anti-miscegenation law that got carried over by the United States government. It determined that the child is indigenous if the mother is indigenous, as long as the father isn't white, then that child is white. If the mother is white and the father is indigenous, the child is indigenous. If the mother is Black and the father is indigenous, the child is Black. If the mother is indigenous and the father is Black, the child is Black. That was law code that people were adhering to until 2000. Ultimately, that was feeding into these blood quantum requirements. And I'm acknowledging that some tribes have adopted that out of necessity and that other tribes, it was imposed on them. And in addition to intermarriage, there's the possibility of adoption. Maybe you're a runaway slave who was formerly adopted by a tribe, to maintain your... There were also cases where Africans who were enslaved to tribal entities were able to purchase their freedom within that entity. We have a complex history of mutual exploitation, and now the power imbalance has shifted dramatically. Black people do have a lot more political power than indigenous people do right now in the United States. And that makes us complicit in this ongoing genocide and ethnocide. These mythologies that we keep constructing around being native is cultural erasure, and people have a right to be upset about that.
Hey, we're back with another reading from an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States. And this time we're going to the section that talks about Black and Indigenous internationalisms during the Progressive Era. So we're going to start by still Native people continue to suffer. Two policies undergirded the Indian problem. The first was the passing of the Dawes Act, which was also known as the General Allotment Act in 1887. Named after Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes, the act, which began the process of parceling out American Indian lands to whites, produced severe consequences. In 1887, tribal lands occupied approximately 138 million acres. By 1934, they had dwindled to a measly 52 million. In addition, as historian David Chang has argued, by making lands private property, allotment made it possible for Native individuals to lose them through direct sales, defaults in mortgages, tax forfeiture sales, and other means. The second policy that was damaging to Native people stemmed from the Supreme Court's 1903 decision in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. The decision effectively gave Congress plenary power over American Indian land rights, meaning that tribal nations would have no control over their land. As indigenous peoples were losing their land and political power as sovereign nations, Black Americans were experiencing extreme racial violence. Black folks suffered much under Jim Crow racial terror during the Progressive Era. Convict leasing, a system designed to preserve the enslavement of Black people after their legal emancipation, was perhaps one of the key sites of Black oppression and exploitation. Though slavery was technically illegal, the 13th Amendment allowed for the enslavement of people who had been convicted of a crime. By purchasing the labor of Black people from Southern states, private companies would receive free labor and the state would earn revenue. The convict leasing system was an earlier iteration of the current prison industrial complex, which legal scholar Michelle Alexander has aptly called the new Jim Crow. Historian Sarah Haley argues that convict leasing was also a gendered experience. Although a minority, Black women suffered under the same system. The state portrayed Black women as deviants in order to exploit them for their labor. Their gendered exploitation ushered in what she calls Jim Crow modernity. She argues that the development of white supremacy during Jim Crow was manufactured through the creation of a carceral state that exploited Black women by using state violence. While all Black folks suffered under the convict leasing system, they also suffered debt peonage and other forms of racial oppression. Interesting to note today that there are still a lot of instances where Black women, femmes, and trans people, gender nonconforming folks, are still experiencing a lot of police violence and incarceration for minor or created or trumped up offenses. And so this is really ringing a bell about how the past continues, excuse me, to be the present.
I'm going to go ahead and say it because you won't. Africans sold our ancestors into slavery. A lot of you need to understand that the concept of race, as we understand it today, did not exist in pre-colonial Africa. Now, race being your physical characteristics and your skin color. Now, in pre-colonial Africa, your identity was rooted in your ethnicity. It was rooted in your regional affiliations, your language, your tribe, your kinship. So when we look at it in terms of, oh, Africans were selling their people or they sold our people into slavery, you have to think in terms of how they were thinking then. They were not selling their people. They were selling rivals. They were selling captives from other tribes, war captives. They were selling them. These weren't their people. They weren't a part of their tribe, their kinship. Race is a very new concept. People definitely identified with their tribes prior to colonization. Several African kingdoms participated in the transatlantic slave trade, mostly for economic reasons. I know a lot of the Pan-Africans like to push, oh, they were tricked, they were tricked, they were tricked. Let's be real. The kingdom of Dahomey was a significant supplier of slaves to the Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade, and they were receiving all types of shit from metal, from mirrors, from alcohol, from guns. You guys have to understand the more guns that they were receiving because they were giving more slaves to the Europeans means that they had more power, more control to capture more slaves and give to the Europeans. The Ashanti again engaged in wars to capture slaves for the Europeans as well. I know a lot of people talk about the Ashanti and talk about how a lot of them were tricked. And listen, I don't feel bad because you were tricked and your ass became a slave too because you were trying to turn other people into slaves. And I know a lot of people like to say, well, they didn't know exactly what was going on in the Americas, which they didn't. When they were capturing up these other Negroes and giving them to these Europeans, they didn't know what was ahead. They didn't know there was going to be decades and centuries and generations of psychological and physical warfare put out on us. But at the same time, if they did know, would they have cared? No. The Afro Confederacy used religious influence and military power to control slave trade routes. They were, and this happened for generations. They knew what was going on. They were well aware of what they were doing. And yes, slavery did exist in Africa prior to colonization. Now, was the slavery different? Yes, it wasn't chattel slavery like it was over in America. However, it was slavery. And we got to stop acting brand new. Africans are selling their people into slavery right now. They're selling their people, they're trafficking their people all over the place. Greedy people do greedy things. They don't care if it's at the expense of their own people. But again, we have to remember, they weren't selling their own people into slavery. They were selling people of other tribes. The concept of race is new. And remember, this was done for economic and for political reasons. They wanted the power, they wanted the guns, they wanted the textiles, they wanted the things that they did not have access to. They wanted these things. I want the money and the cars and the clothes. That's what they want. They wanted it. And they didn't care at what expense it came. So no, I'm not sitting here kumbaya and gonna sit here and pretend like, oh, Africans were tricked. They didn't know. So they knew what they. Let me explain something to you. They might not have known to the extent, but they definitely had their hand in it, and they were wrong. And I feel like if y'all not gonna hold Africans today, the descendants, accountable for what their ancestors did, then y'all need to not be so quick to hold white people accountable. Because I'm gonna hold them both accountable.
Clearly, those people who claim to be the real natives or indigenous to America do not represent Black Americans. Blacks always stand firm that it is them adding to the erasure of natives and disrespect to their own ancestors. What they don't need is for whites to disrespect their ancestors. What's your thoughts on this episode? Leave a comment and let's engage. And don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Thank you, family. Bye.